Sego, it is May 11th. I want to welcome you to Let's Talk Native on the LTN Radio Network. This program breaks all the rules for Native radio. No buffalo speeches, no mystic healing, no special Indian prayers. We tackle the real issues facing Native people with a look back at our glorious and our grave history, a tough look at where we're at now, and a look forward to our ongoing battles for sovereignty and autonomy. Let's Talk Native is produced in association with Iroquois Promotions on the LTN Radio Network, streaming live from the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation and simulcast and rebroadcast on the Gwe. That's CKWE in Dandanega. You can find our audio streaming 24/7 from our archives and streaming live when we're live at www.ltnradionet.com. And, of course, we are streaming live on Facebook. I am John Kane, I'm the show's host and producer. And I want to, again, plug the opening song. It's from Freight Train. That's Robert Freight Train Parker and Company, and that was Live My Life Too Fast. As I mentioned on Monday with Robert joining me on the show, their live CD, his first and only so far CD, is up, nominated as for Best Blues album at the Indigenous Music Awards to be held on May 18th, I believe. So I wish him luck for that, and I figure I'll play a little bit of Freight Train as we go. Look, if you haven't caught it, I did a interview on The Takeaway, and The Takeaway is an NPR program. It is produced out of WNYC in New York City. It is not just a national show; it's carried internationally, and so it was an opportunity for me to bring up a perspective on a series that they were doing about identity. Now, to frame this thing, The Takeaway is a long running show, but they've got a brand new show host this week, and that's Tenzina Vega, and as I saw what they were doing with changing some format and doing some of these series on identity, one of the things I couldn't help but notice that as they talked about identity, what they were really talking about was the diversity that made up Americans, and how for all of the diversity, and as it related to immigrants and different cultures that have come to the United States, and doggone it, we're all Americans kind of thing. And I felt like, let me throw something else in there. So I offered a different perspective from a people who predate America and predate the United States. And so this is what I offered in a commentary, and they took the bait. And by they, I mean not just Tenzina Vega, but her producer, Ellen Frankman. They got right on it, and in her opening debut week as the host of this show, and this is an award-winning show, they decided that I was going to be their showstopper on this identity series for the first week. So they hooked me up. I went down to meet up with Jerry Urban at WBFO Studios here in Buffalo, and we connected up, and I did a taped interview, which aired this morning. It aired today, various time slots across the country. I want to play that, so we'll open up the show with the segment that was done by Tenzina Vega, and then I want to expand the thoughts. But one of the things that you gotta, that kind of struck me is the segment opens up with a lot of voices, diverse voices, talking about what it is that they feel is their identity as Americans, and then the music stops. So we'll go to it. This is Tenzina Vega's opening week with the Takeaway. We'll go ahead.
And it's the end of week 1 for me here on The Takeaway, but the conversation we started about identity in this country is only just the beginning. Me, beyond being a native New Yorker, a journalist, and a bit of a coffee lover, there's so many other layers to who I am, and I'm sure many of you feel the same way. So now it's your turn.
Hi, I'm Kevin from San Jose, and being a white male, I never had to think about who I am or where I am, and I've never actually felt like I belong to any one label, because none of them specifically describe me. Life isn't that simple.
I'm Pam Venn from St. Louis, Missouri, and I describe myself as an atheist Jew who celebrates Christmas and feels guilty about it.
My name is Dana. I'm from Evanston, Illinois. I work as a sign language interpreter for those who are deaf and hard of hearing, and many people identify proudly as deaf and as part of a cultural and linguistic minority in our country.
On Twitter, Jay Exla says, quote, I view myself as an African-American atheist. Both categories are hugely problematic in America. Also on Twitter, quote, I'm a black conservative who believes the Republican Party are not taking advantage of people like myself. We are here and ignored by the party. And we had a bunch of calls that reiterated that point.
Hi, my name is Addie, and I am calling from Virginia. I'm a black conservative, and I'm very disappointed in the party and the president. The party is currently focused on the chosen few. They failed to reach out to other black conservatives out there. We're hardworking, and frankly, we're doing very well, and we intend on to continue to do well, and without jeopardizing our political beliefs. And we are here.
One of the least focused on communities are black and brown conservatives. All right, a few more calls from you.
Hello, I'm Oliver Sims. The older I get and the more racially related fatigue I experience, the more committed I am to being African American. I'm in the top 5% of income earners, master degreed, and successful by any measure. But when it comes down to perception and treatment, when a consumer, I'm a black man, plain and simple.
Hey, my name is Ana Hernandez, and I'm calling from New York City. I am Puerto Rican, poor. I answer to she, hers, his, they, theirs. All good. I grew up as a gender non-conforming trumpet-playing lesbian, and I think life is short, so you should show love now, because it's all about the relationships.
The label I use is wheelchair user. And everything from architecture to averting eyes shapes me daily. Ann Hart, Palm Desert, California.
I do not identify as an American.
Not an American. This voice stopped us in our tracks this week as we were debating labels and politics and race and faith in this country. And that's John Garhio Kane. He's a Native activist and radio host and member of the Mohawk tribe.
I'm Mohawk, but that's not even our word. That's a word that is placed on us. I'm the Mohawk word, and I know this sounds strange, but the Mohawk word for Mohawk is Gunyagahaga.
John heard our coverage of this changing American identity and reached out to us to say, hey, I don't fall under this big American umbrella.
The reason I reached out to the program is because there are Native people, and I'm among them, who don't identify ourselves as Americans. We still maintain that we are Native, that we are Mohawks, Oneidas, Senecas. And this can go, across what we call Turtle Island, that many of us identify ourselves as our original peoples. And we reject the notion of being forced into this American mosaic because it is our distinction and our autonomy and our sovereignty that we assert and that we promote and that we look to carry into the future.
There are 573 federally recognized tribes in the United States. But as a Mohawk, John doesn't seek federal recognition. While he lives on Native territory in upstate New York, John says he does not live on American soil and he does not feel American.
For Native people, we rarely have the opportunity to identify ourselves because we've been so misidentified and redefined by everybody from Hollywood to government to even the use of mascots. And I oftentimes talk about the unique racism that Native people experience, not suggesting that it's worse than any other form of racism, but it certainly is unique because of the history and because of who we assert that we are, not just a people looking for equality within the American system, but that distinction and that autonomy.
And it's interesting. I wonder if, we're seeing a resurgence, obviously, or maybe not a resurgence, but an emergence in some cases of new labels and new forms of identifying. And often for communities of color in this country, a lot of that is trying to cut through the sort of colonialist, ideas of assimilation and get right right to the core of who we really are. Are you seeing this resurgence among younger natives, where there's this sort of awareness that maybe wasn't there before, a connectedness to not so much to the United States of America, but to these sovereign ideals?
Well, part of it is really born out of the struggle for identity. And I think there is such confusion amongst Native people because of the history and because of so many oppressive policies that the United States has had over the years, including the one that they call assimilation, because it's still stripped away who we are. I mean, everything from the residential schools where the policy was kill the Indian, save the man. So the idea of, cutting off the hair, or forbidding the language, putting Native kids in uniform and trying to condition them to rid themselves of that primitiveness as it was labeled, and to strip that away. So what we have now, it's been building since the 70s. What you have now are people, young people in particular, like you suggest, that are clearly confused about who they are. And do they have to be Americans because somebody said so? I mean, if you look at, the legal basis for that, in 1924, the United States passes the Indian Citizenship Act, where they simply declare that all Native people are citizens. By the time you come out of World War II, it is clearly established that the idea of a nation trying to denationalize a population and impose their nationalized views on them is considered a war crime. Yet there you have this act of Congress in 1924 saying that all Native people are hereby U.S. citizens, even if we're not asking them to be. And I think many young people are becoming more and more aware of this. And part of it is the internet, the access to information. There's a lot more books being written and that kind of thing. But there's also a lot more conversation about the gaps in what we were taught as kids in the American public schools. And it's not just about making us angry about that history, but saying, wait a second, our history isn't the same as everybody else's history. So if our history is different, what does that mean about our present, and what does that mean about our future?
And I want to talk about that a little. Native communities are often some of the least covered in the media and some of the least talked about when it comes to issues of identity and many of these other issues. Has the history, has this exploitation, has this lack of attention, if you will, and other forms of oppression shaped different Native communities and almost reinforced this idea of becoming independent and independent entities?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the whole idea of our identity has already been so manipulated by the outside. And of course, what is our relationship, with the state and the federal government? And this is the challenge that we often have. We are still being pushed into complying with state laws, even on our own territories. And even with Andrew Cuomo, we're in a constant battle with this notion of native to native trade, suggesting that somehow we have to comply with state laws when there's no basis in law to suggest that. And we, as Native people, we can't travel internationally unless we get a U.S. passport. I mean, you go back to 2010, the Iroquois Nationals lacrosse team, which had traveled on Haudenosaunee passports, were denied the opportunity to go play at the World Games in Manchester, England, because the United States and Great Britain were indifferent about the use of Haudenosaunee passports. So the Iroquois Nationals didn't get to play in the World Games of lacrosse, which is kind of absurd all by itself. But so this whole notion that in spite of the fact that there is an international standard established by the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the United States still stands in stark violation of almost all of the articles of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And in fact, you could argue that there's not a judge or a politician in the United States that will place enough priority on an international standard to say, well, maybe we need to rethink what that relationship is and how we go forward. So as more information and we are able to research our own histories a little bit, we've reclaimed much of what was stripped away by programs, by Hollywood, by the media, even by the use of mascots and that kind of thing. When I was a kid growing up, there were a lot of Native kids who said, they'd root for the Washington Redskins because there was nothing else.
I want to get to that point, though, right?
Okay.
There are kids that said they would root for the Redskins. I'm sure there are Natives people who will disagree with you, who will say, hey, I am an American and I identify with the tribe, and those things can coexist.
Well, they can and they do, but when you put that question to somebody and you ask, are you an American or are you Navajo or are you Mohawk or are you Oneida or are you Seneca? All of a sudden they think, well, if there's a choice to be made, and then where do you prioritize? So is your identity really Seneca or is it really American? That question invites more questions. And those are the questions that rarely are we allowed to ask. I mean, everything from, a Native kid being, somewhat compelled to pledge allegiance to the, to the flag or sing the national anthem, that kind of thing. This is still something that when a Native kid doesn't do that, they are still met with a lot of pressure, to follow suit and to conform.
And why is it, in your opinion, so important for a sovereign identity to be preserved?
Because we fade away otherwise. I mean, assimilation is still genocide. If you look at the definition of genocide, the idea of making a people, disappear. And if you try to assimilate us or try to subjugate us or absorb us into the United States, then the question is, do we still exist?
That was John Garhio Kane, a Native activist and radio host. Thanks so much, John.
All right. Thank you very much for having me on your program.
Want to listen to any of our identity conversations this week? They're all up on thetakeaway.org. Tell us what you think over at our Facebook page.
So that was it. That was my interview with Tanzina Vega on The Takeaway. And that's obviously it's a national program. So, yeah, so I got a chance to put a perspective out that did catch her by surprise. Like I said, I love the way she stopped the music and it almost came to an echo when I said, "No, I'm not an American." I thought this was a good interview, and I thought it offered something that it rarely ever gets a national platform. So I know I've seen the feedback that I've gotten from this interview, and it's all been pretty positive. Although I did get one of my my Facebook friends did ask me the question, well, why is it okay to identify yourself as a Mohawk if that's not really your word, and still have a problem with identifying yourself as an American when America is the place? And at least that was the implication. And of course, I did kind of qualify and explain why I used, even in using the word Mohawk. Part of the problem is if I come on to a national radio show and I say, look, I'm Gunyagahaga, most people are going to have no idea what I'm talking about. So I don't frame it a little bit and use the word that they are familiar with. I mean, it'd be the same thing as me coming on and saying, I'm Gunyagahaga and not explain that, not frame it by saying I'm not an American. If I don't make that case, then it doesn't quite have the message. So the other thing I think is important to realize is that the word America and the expression American has been appropriated by the United States. So when people say America, oftentimes they just assume that you're talking about the United States. And if you're going to use that word as the name of a landmass, then you're talking about an entire hemisphere. You're talking about North, Central, and South America to call it America. But that's not the way people use the word. The word American has been appropriated by the United States to mean a U.S. citizen. And in fact, even Tanzina Vega was oftentimes using that word American, as almost as a, I don't even want to say a euphemism, but I guess as a euphemism for a U.S. citizen. So when I say that I'm not an American, what I'm saying is I'm not a U.S. citizen. And and again, to use that word America or American to describe just a person of a place, there's a lot more implied by the word American than just an inhabitant of the continent. So so I think that it's important to make that distinction. I mean, it's an interesting thing when I was watching some of the videos that NPR posted up about people explaining their identity. One of the folks was somebody who had recently become a U.S. citizen from Honduras, and she didn't use the word U.S. citizen. She kept saying American. Now I feel like I'm really an American. So the fact that she came from a part of the American continents didn't make her an American. I mean, let's face it. U.S. citizens don't look at Mexicans as Americans, or Canadians as Americans for that matter, even though they're white like them. So, look, it is clear that when we use the word America and Americans, it oftentimes is almost directly associated with the United States, and whether that's proper or not is a whole nother is a whole nother conversation. But again, I have to thank not only Tanzina Vega for including me in her debut week. I mean, this is to me that's it's an honor to be a significant participant and essentially the curtain. I closed the curtain on her final week with a statement that isn't really that bold. At least I don't think it's that bold, but it's just not one that's heard often. And I've gotten message after message after message all through the day today from people who are saying, "Hell yeah, yeah, I'm glad you said that." Or I've said the same thing, or I feel the same way. I have not gotten one comment, and I actually expected a few. I didn't get one comment from somebody saying, "What the hell are you talking about? How dare you say that we aren't Americans?" I did have some people suggest that they know people who would take offense to, or find that position problematic, but I didn't have anybody respond directly to me to say, what the hell are you doing? What are you doing to us here? And so I'm comforted by that, but I'm also glad that the takeaway is getting decent feedback from this response, because obviously I've got a lot to say on a lot of issues, not just issues of identity. And when I think about the perspective that is rarely offered, even on environmental issues, or even on the mascot issue, or on social justice issues. I mean, there are a lot of things that people just aren't aware of. Missing and murdered Indigenous women. I mean, that's still a major issue that in spite of the Me Too movement and all of this other stuff, violence against women, it still doesn't get the traction and the attention that it deserves. So I'll keep talking about that stuff. I mean, when we talk about the fact that Native people proportionally, are killed at a higher rate than any other people by police, that's something that is rarely known to most people. And of course, all the historical stuff. I mean, when I mentioned Lincoln signing an execution order that would result in the largest mass execution in the history of the United States, and that occurs a week before, the day after Christmas, but a week before he signs the Emancipation Proclamation into law. These are pieces of history that are rarely talked about. I mean, I seen there's there's a new documentary about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, or and they're calling her the notorious RBG, doing a play on BIG, but they're not going to mention the fact that Ruth Bader Ginsburg cites in footnote number 1 the doctrine of Christian discovery as an argument or a point to throw an Oneida land claim. They aren't going to talk about the fact that this liberal Jewish justice cites 15th century church dogma as an excuse to throw to give any legitimacy to our right to reacquire lost lands, and to reacquire lost lands that were lost through fraud, and that we have we even have a Supreme Court case suggesting we have a right to claim title. So I mean, when I think about the things that aren't talked about, that's why for me, trying to have a good showing on this program was important to me. And who knows, maybe we'll get a chance to have my voice and our voice heard a little more often, and not just and this was my point, and not just the same Native voices that seem to always bubble to the top, the ones who frankly haven't said anything really meaningful in many years. And one of the things that that didn't make the cut in this interview was the reference that I did make to Tanzina, that there are people that that embrace their affinity to the United States, in spite of that terrible history, in spite of massacres, and in spite of residential schools, in spite of the abject poverty that most of our territories exist in spite of all of that, the actual oppression that still exists on our territories, there are still plenty of Native people that are just hoping they can catch what drops off the table from from the American government or whatever, and of course I'm not among those people. I believe asserting sovereignty, asserting our autonomy and distinction, in the face of incredible odds. There's no question about that. But I'm not talking about going to war. I'm not talking when I say asserting it, I mean standing up to New York State when they're trying to crush our economy. And I'm talking about standing up to the federal government when they want to do one of their federal infrastructure projects through our territories, or they want to tax us, or whatever they want to do. These are things that I think we all should do as a part of our identity. And look, even people who are fairly compliant with state and federal laws and policies within quote unquote Indian country, there comes a time where even those who have been compliant in the past stand up. And that's when that reality check comes in. And that's when young people get energized. Look, there are powers that be in Canada who are so concerned about another ramping up of the Idle No More movement. They are so concerned. In fact, a few years ago, their MacDonald-Laurier Commission issued a couple of reports. In fact, Douglas Bland, who was an author, wrote this whole report where he used an Ivy League model to gauge the likelihood of an insurrection in Canada perpetrated by Native peoples, and using that model, that computer model, determined that Canada was ripe for an Indigenous peoples insurrection, and cited the things that would that could tip it off, citing all of the attributes or the character of Canada that made it a breeding ground for that potential, including unprotected infrastructure and an impoverished Native population with a lot of younger people in that population group. The disproportionate number of Native people who are locked up and who have criminal records and who are living fairly impoverished lives. And the same thing goes for on the U.S. side of that imaginary line. So, look, while I'm not calling for an armed revolution or for a mass reclamation of lost lands, what I am calling for is us to stand up for what we do have and what we are pushing forward on. Look, we're at the bottom of the hour, so we'll take a break, and when we come back, I want to go a little bit more on the subject, maybe touch on a few other things as well. But let's take a break, and we'll come back after this. This is John Kane, and this is Let's Talk Native.
Everybody get on your feet. You make me nervous when you're in your seat. Take off your shoes and pat your feet. Can't be beat with barefoot. Hey, we're barefoot. Barefoot. Hey, we're barefoot. Went to a party the other night. Long tall Sally was out of sight. Two-way wig and her high sneakers too. She was doing a dance without any shoes. We're barefoot.
Barefootin' from Freight Train Live. That's the CD, the album that is up for Blues Album of the Year at the Indigenous Music Awards. That's coming up next week. So I wish Robert and company the best of luck. And again, I congratulate them for the nomination. Just to get recognized, especially for your first CD you've ever put out. I mean, that's a pretty good thing. All right, let me go ahead and give my props to my sponsors, Ross and Holly John and the RJE family of businesses, Eric White and ERW Enterprises, and Legacy 420 in Tandanega. And I also want to thank individuals, the friends of mine who, from time to time, will drop a check in the mail, that helps us do what we do, both here on the Cattaraugus territory of Seneca Nation and in the show, of course, that I do in New York on WBAI. I want to thank Ed Schindler and Cynthia Trice, Neville Spring. I also want to thank Roger Jock and others who, from time to time, contribute. But I always feel like I need to acknowledge and thank those who have helped in the past, because I wouldn't be on the cusp of entering our 9th year doing Let's Talk Native if I didn't have some of you who advertised and donated and sponsored this program, especially when I was on commercial radio. And, that experience of doing that commercial radio and having some of those relationships, like I said, to do this segment for the takeaway, which is kind of a big deal. I mean, it really, for me, to have that kind of national platform to voice the kinds of things that many of you heard me talk about before, but it doesn't usually resonate. So now we've had a chance to get that message out on a national platform, but that wouldn't happen if I didn't have the contacts at WBFO and some familiarity with some of the other stations in New York and all of that. I was thrilled to get a text message from somebody in New York. They said, "Hey, did you just do the takeaway today?" And I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "I heard you. I didn't hear your name, but I recognized your voice." And so that was kind of cool. And again, to be a part of Tenzina Vega's debut week as the host, that was a bit of an honor as well. So again, I want to thank the producers, Ellen Frankman and at WNYC, and Jerry Urban at WBFO for helping that to happen. Yeah, perhaps we'll have more of that coming down the pike. But the subject matter, I think, was important, and it was interesting to not only hear how many ways people define themselves, how they identify themselves, and the calls that came in. And there's also a bit of a video that plays on the Takeaways website where people have done given their opinions on camera. And it's amazing when you look at not just the diversity in the way people look, but in their stories and how they're all trying to coalesce for some of the a piece of that American dream, right? A piece of that that affluence that America has represented. And then there's us. Then there's Native people. Those of us who were driven off of our lands. We had our population diminished. I mean, by some accounts, up to 95% of our population was wiped out, and it wasn't just wiped out by us having some poor immune system. I mean, we were a healthy, vibrant people. The fact that disease played a part in some of our demise, that was disease that was intentionally spread, not only with smallpox blankets and of course starving our people into conditions where our health was sacrificed, or the introduction of alcohol as a stimulant for treaty making. I mean, when the U.S. would requisition supplies to enter into treaties, not only would they have their shiny trinkets, but they'd make sure they had plenty of barrels of rum to loosen people up so they could get what they wanted. So the introduction of alcohol, the introduction of living off of government commodities and that kind of stuff, that weakened our people, and it weakened our people health-wise, mentally and physically. I mean, the food, instead of us eating the healthy foods that we lived on for thousands of years, now we consider fry bread a part of one of these native staples. we didn't have flour or that kind of oil to make fry bread yet. That's what we consider native food these days. I mean, so I think about how much they've decimated us, and of course, the other issue with disease and the decimation of our population ties directly to the residential schools. Keep in mind, in Canada specifically, when they ran the numbers, there was a 50% mortality rate for Native people in the Canadian residential schools. Much of that tied directly to tuberculosis and the absolute refusal and failure to quarantine the kids who would invariably become sick, because it was almost intentional. It was almost intentional, and of course there were a staggering number of deaths that took place. Many of them associated with abuse, not just neglect, but abuse, malnutrition. And of course there was abuse, sexual abuse. There was also a sterilization program that would target, specifically it would target, and again, I hate to use this word, but what the United States would recognize as full bloods, because this was a people that would take more generations to assimilate, at least from an appearance standpoint. If you already had some people that were the quote unquote half breeds, well, they were already on their way. They were already going to intermingle and intermarry with whites, so it was okay. But if you had some full bloods or perhaps some mixed race with black, then by all means let's sterilize. Let's get those women up in the stirrups and those young girls, and make sure they don't breed. This was a real thing. This isn't just a rumor. This is an urban legend. These are the things that were specifically done to kill us. And again, in the case of sterilization, that was killing our young before they had a chance. So when I talk about our population going from whether it was 50 or 100 million people down to what, and our population now only represents less than 0.7% of 1%. I mean, of the population in the United States. So to suggest that we are marginalized people that's can't be overstated enough. I mean, there is nobody. There are no people that are more marginalized than Native people. And when you look at where our territories are and the economic opportunities that exist on our territories, our people live in the most impoverished conditions of any other people in the United States, and the same goes for Canada as well. I mean, third world conditions. These aren't the conditions that we lived in prior to European contact. We lived as a thriving people, not affluence in the terms of gold and riches the way Europeans would measure it, but we had a higher quality of life. We had a better psychological quality of life in terms of equality and we had those times where we were at war, and we persevered through that. The fact that people want to label us as that noble savage or as that warrior, that fierce warrior. I mean, the fact that they'll even suggest that's why our people enlist in the armed forces at a higher rate is because of our warrior culture. No, we were people of peace. We fought when we had to, and sometimes when we thought we had to and we didn't. And to the extent that our people enlisted at the highest rates of any other ethnic group, for lack of a better distinction, I guess, in the United States, has more to do with the lack of hope and the lack of opportunities that exist on our territories or exist for us as a people, even when we don't live on our territories. So, I think it's important that people understand not just the real history, but the real present. I mean, the facts as they exist today, and the struggles that we go through. And I think, and this is where, again, I'm thankful and grateful to the takeaway for allowing me to have even that brief opportunity to offer a perspective that is rarely ever heard. But this is where it's on us. We need to make sure that we promote the conversation. If there's one thing that I get from the folks who listen to my show or read something that I've written, or whatever, is when somebody tells me, I'm glad you said that. I'm glad that you put to words what many of us have thought. And now it makes it a little easier for us to bring those words to the surface as well. Let's have the conversation. Let's continue to promote our autonomy and our distinction and our sovereignty. Let's assert that sovereignty. I always say sovereignty is not our defense for what we do. Sovereignty is not our defense; it's what we defend. And so, when I'm asked that question, why do it? And my answer is simple, because if we don't, then we will cease to exist. I mean, the current Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, his father literally was quoted when he was the Prime Minister of Canada, said, "Look, if you don't speak your language, and if you're not practicing your culture, then you're not native." And I'm paraphrasing, but he basically said, you've been assimilated. And of course, as I mentioned last week, that use of the word, or that word assimilate, implies that we were just absorbed. And one of the things that, again, one of my listeners from and callers from New York suggested was perhaps assimilation isn't the right word. And I think that's probably an accurate statement, because we weren't absorbed into that American, quilt. we were placed at the bottom of it, right along with black people and other very marginalized people. But there was no training ground for doctors and lawyers in those residential schools, and there are very few opportunities. And of course, because there are so very, very few opportunities for Native people in most of our territories, the goal oftentimes is to drive us off of our territories. Especially, let's grab the best and the brightest. Let's grab anybody who shows any kind of aptitude. Let's give them a pathway off the reservation, as they say, and let's bring them in. Let's adopt them out to a white family so they can really see their potential. And on an individual basis, oftentimes people say, "Well, yeah, that Native kid did very good because he was raised by white people." Well, as a individual human being, he may have reached a level of success according to white man standards that he wouldn't have had on our territories. But what is never recognized is by removing those people from our territories, we are essentially taking our best and brightest and leaving behind the people who are intended to be left behind. And that's why our territories continue to struggle. That's why they struggle with substance abuse, alcohol addiction, teen pregnancy, high school dropouts, the low unemployment isn't about the character of the people. It's about the conditions of our territories. And even when we strike into something and we venture into something, whether it's gaming or the tobacco industry, we are met with layer and layer and layer of additional regulations. The fact that that the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act would put the states, who we are almost constantly at odds with on most of our economic development, put the states in some sort of regulatory position as it relates to that specific Native industry is bizarre. I mean, especially when you consider some of the states who entered into compacts with Native peoples, including New York State, couldn't do the kind of gaming that they were involved in regulating on Native territories. They couldn't do a casino because it was a violation of their constitution. Yet they could be involved in regulating ours. This is the kind of absurdity and hypocrisy that exists. So when I suggest to Tanzina Vega that we need to stand on our sovereignty and our autonomy and our distinction so we don't fade away, we need to make sure that people are aware that there are international standards that the United States isn't meeting, that Canada is not meeting, and we need to assert them. Not just find some court of law to assert them in, but we need to make sure that when we sit down with anybody that we find ourselves in a potential conflict with, let them walk away from an international standard. But man, if we don't raise it in the first place, then shame on us. But let's make sure that we have this conversation enough so that all of us are equipped to have the conversation. not just somebody who got elected onto a quote-unquote tribal council. And certainly, let's not leave it in the hands of the white lawyers hired by every one of these nations that tries to homogenize the Native position. I mean, the very thing that many of us stand up to is this notion of pan-Indianism, this idea that they can have a body of federal Indian law that they can apply to all of us. When simply they simply can't. We are not one people. I'm not going to get into the whole 573 federally recognized tribes either. But we are indigenous peoples where we all have our own distinction. And among the distinction that we have is also the relationships and the distinct relationships we have, not only with the local people, that the non-native public around us, the state, the federal government, and the international community. These are the things that but first and foremost, we should stand with each other with that distinction and with that diversity that we all represent. We should stand together, but not as one people, as many peoples. We should stand together as indigenous peoples with proud of that diversity, but also standing there and we should be able to cite each other's relationships, each other's treaties, if you will, and say, look, you can't just have a blanket policy that over all native peoples. We've had individual. I mean, like I said, for us, Haudenosaunee, our lands are held in trust for us by the federal government. When people talk about land acquisition, a reclamation of native lands, the standard line out there is what they call a fee to trust, where land is taken from being held under a fee title under the United States and then put into or a state and then put into federal trust for our use and enjoyment. That's not how we hold our lands. No, that's not how we hold our land. We actually own the lands. We hold the title, absolute title, not a U.S. title, not a state title, not a county deed. That's not how our lands are held. And if somebody produced those documents, they're fraud. So we need to make sure that we use each other's strengths rather than being weakened by each other's weaknesses. You know, there's two ways of looking at this thing. But I think we have to make sure that we stand on our sovereignty, and not just believe that we have to have lawyers and lobbyists protecting us from the federal government or federal legislation, or that we need to have state or federal legislation passed to bolster our existence. We need to own who we are. We need to assert our identity, but we also need to assert our role and our responsibilities in that identity. You know, my friend Paul Delarone, De Gorundige, is always saying, people always want to talk about rights, but nobody wants to talk about responsibilities. There are no rights if you don't have responsibility. If you're not willing to work for something, and I don't mean just for pay, and I'm not talking about the whole bootstraps thing, but if you're not willing to work and put your effort in and fulfill the responsibilities you have to your family, to your children, to your community, then there's no rights to assert. If all you're doing is sitting there hoping that somebody's going to allow you to do something, I don't want permission. And I don't want forgiveness. I want respect. And I'm not asking, for our sovereignty to be respected because it's somehow going to benefit those that respect it, although it will. I mean, as I look at this invitation that from the New York State Senate Select Committee on State and Native Relations, they want to capitalize on the assets. The state wants to capitalize on the assets that Native territories represent, Native peoples represent. Well, that asset's our sovereignty. They can't fight it on one hand and then hope to capitalize on the other. So I mean, this is where the conversation that I think starts sometimes here on this show, but certainly got a good kickstart by being on a national radio show like the Takeaway. I'm hoping the conversation continues, and I hope those of you who heard the interview and hear my show on a twice a week here on the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation, and once a week in New York. I hope when you hear that you take something away from it, even if you're somewhat critical of the perspective. Then draw your own perspective, draw your own conclusions, and apply your own critical thinking to our existence. Because I think it's a shame if by the time we look at our grandchildren, the best we can hope for is that they can claim to be of Native descent rather than saying, no, I'm Oneida, I'm Mohawk, I'm Seneca, I'm Ojibwe, I'm Anishinaabe. I mean, that's what we need to understand, that there's a difference between being a people and being a citizen of a country that has been working for hundreds of years to subjugate us. That's what we have to be aware of, and that's what we have to work towards. And there are opportunities. I mean, the thing about asserting our sovereignty and defending that sovereignty is that there are opportunities with that. Look, we wouldn't have the gaming that we do have, even with federal law, hanging over it, and state regulators hanging over it. We wouldn't have that if we didn't assert it. The reason that, we asserted that different types of gaming, and then they tried to shut us down. Went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court had to rule in our favor, in a way. And then they had to try to frame a federal law that would, that could somehow make clear what the relationship is between the federal government and Native territories as we entered into gaming. It wasn't necessary for us; it was necessary for them. But the same thing, is when we assert our rights to, our rights to do something, we're not asking permission. The first time we set up a smoke shop to sell cigarettes without New York State tax on it, we didn't get a permit. We didn't get permission from the state. We had to fight like hell to find a supplier who was willing to supply us. And when that started to go away, we had to fight like hell to build our own brands. Now, if we took that same level of commitment that it took to develop gaming in the face of adversity, and even in the face of of federal and state regulatory controls, and if we took the same effort that it took to develop our place in the tobacco industry and applied it to other places and stood up to the state, and I'm not just talking about cannabis, but I'm talking about cannabis too, and hemp, but by whatever means that we can, and I'll use the word, exploit our regulatory advantages, we should. I mean, there's not a county, there's not a town, there's not a state, there's not a country that doesn't exploit its advantages somehow, whether it's their climate, whether it's the natural resources, whether it's the human resources, whether it's the taxes, or of course, although I don't want to go there, but the lax environmental laws. That's why you have some places that are being tore up by extractive industries, or really destructive dumping. And part of that all comes out of, what are we willing to exploit? Well, I would much rather exploit our regulatory advantages as it relates to the cost of doing business than jeopardize our environmental issues. I would hate to see, and I do hate to see, Native territories jumping into the extractive industries, whether it's natural gas here on the Seneca Nation, or whether it's coal in Navajo territory, or frankly even some of the exploitation of lumber and water resources that have taken place in many of our territories. I think we have to be careful, and we should make sure, to the extent that we do utilize natural resources, that we do it at a rate that makes sense, so we don't destroy the environment, and we do it responsibly. But I mean, so beyond the environmental issues, we also have to make sure that as we pursue certain industries or certain commercial enterprises, that it's culturally appropriate, that we have, that it's something that we can create as a legacy for our children. Renewable energy, for instance. I know Seneca Nation's done a couple of projects. They got a windmill up here in Cattaraugus, and a solar farm down in Allegheny. But we should be doing more, and we should assert our sovereignty as we develop some of this stuff, renewable energy issues. I myself, I just began a venture looking at doing a tiny home project. These are among the things that we have to really take a solid look at, and I'll save that conversation for a future show. But these are the kind of conversations that we need to have. We have to assert a future going forward. We can't sacrifice who we are as people. We can't sacrifice our sovereignty and our autonomy. And if we think that just being an American is enough to seal your quest for the American dream, I'm sorry, we're the wrong color, folks. We're the wrong color for that. And we better make sure that as we pursue our future, that we reclaim what has been taken. And I'm not just talking land. I'm talking sovereignty. I'm talking about our autonomy and our distinction. We need to reclaim our identity. And as much as there are people of every color, every race, every creed, every every type of distinction that may exist for Americans, for U.S. citizens, none of those are us. That we assert ourselves as the people who we always were. And not to say that we don't progress, but we need to assert ourselves as the original people, as Ongwe Ongwe. I'm John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. I'll see you Monday.
I want somebody to love me. I need somebody I can hold. I want somebody to be my baby, satisfy my soul. I want somebody. I need somebody. Want somebody. Need somebody like me. Lay home not so restless, sleeping by myself. I need love so bad, pretty baby, just can't help myself. I want somebody.